He didn't warn her. He didn't argue. Silas Crow just walked straight into the smokehouse, lifted the first crock off the shelf, and poured it out onto the dirt floor. Then the second, then the third. 40 pounds of curing brine, 3 weeks of Marlowe Bennett's work, gurgled into the mud while every man on the Blackstone Ranch stood in a half circle and watched. Some of them looked away. A few almost smiled. And Garrett Blackstone, the man who had hired her, the man who had shaken her hand and said, "You have my full authority here." He stood at the edge of the group with his jaw tight and his hands in his pockets, and he said absolutely nothing. Marlowe didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood in the middle of that smokehouse with brine soaking through the toes of her boots, and she looked at Silas Crow and she made herself breathe. Because she had learned a long time ago that the moment you break in front of men like that, you've already lost. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, if you've ever had someone destroy something you built just to prove a point, then you already know exactly what Marlowe felt standing in that doorway. And if you want to find out what she did next, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single chapter of this story, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all started. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday in late August, forwarded 3 times before it finally caught up with Marlowe in Billings, where she was finishing a 6-month contract with a meatpacking operation that had no intention of renewing it. The foreman there had told her straight, nothing personal, owner wants someone local, which was the cleanest way of saying what the owner had actually said, which Marlowe had overheard through a half-open office door. I'm not paying that kind of wage to a woman who looks like she ate the last 3 employees. She had finished her last shift anyway, tallied her hours, collected her pay, and walked out without a scene because scenes cost energy she couldn't afford to waste. The letter was written on ranch stationery, the kind with a branded letterhead that ranchers used when they wanted to seem more serious than they were. It was from a man named Garrett Blackstone, and it was 2 paragraphs long and entirely without charm. I run a cattle operation in the Montana Highlands, 40 miles north of Havre. The smokehouse that services this ranch has been sitting idle for 3 years due to a series of unfortunate circumstances I won't detail here. I need someone who can restore it to working condition before first snowfall and manage full winter production through the season. I am not looking for someone to hold my hand or explain why the task is difficult. I am looking for someone who can do the work. Your name was given to me by a contact at the Billings stockyard, who described your methods as unconventional and your results as difficult to argue with. If you are interested in a fair wage and full operational authority over the smokehouse, write back. If you are going to negotiate before you've even seen the place, don't bother. Marlowe read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time, slower, paying attention to what wasn't there. He hadn't asked her age. He hadn't asked whether she was married. He hadn't described the physical requirements of the job in that particular way. Men sometimes described them when they wanted to screen out women without saying so directly. He had just described a problem and asked if she could solve it. She wrote back the same night, I'll come see it. Don't hire anyone else before I arrive. She didn't know, when she sealed that envelope, that she was walking into a war. She thought she was walking into a job. Blackstone Ranch sat at the end of a road that stopped being paved about 12 miles before it reached the gate. Marlowe arrived in a hired wagon on a Thursday morning in the first week of September, and the first thing she noticed was that the property looked tired in a specific way. Not neglected exactly, but worn, like something that had been working hard for a long time without anyone paying attention to whether it was holding up. The main house was solid enough. 2 stories, good timber, a covered porch that ran the length of the front. The outbuildings were well maintained. The fencing was recent. Someone here knew how to run a ranch. Someone here was working hard. The smokehouse was around the back, separate from the other structures by about 30 yards, which was smart planning. You didn't want a fire risk pressed up against your main buildings. But even from a distance, Marlowe could see that it had been sitting empty. The venting pipe had rusted at the seams. One of the side panels had warped outward. The door didn't sit right in its frame. She climbed down from the wagon before the driver had fully stopped, which was a habit she'd never been able to break, and she walked toward the smokehouse without waiting for anyone to greet her. "You must be the woman Blackstone hired." She turned around. 3 men were watching her from the fence line beside the nearest barn. The one who had spoken was lean and weathered, maybe 50, with the kind of face that had stopped being readable a long time ago. He was looking at her the way you look at something you're already disappointed by. "Marlowe Bennett," she said. "And you are?" "Silas Crow." He said it like it should mean something. "I run the hands on this ranch." "Good," she said. "Then you can tell me who has the key to the smokehouse." He didn't move. "Why don't you come back in the spring? Maybe we'll have something easier for you by then." The two men behind him didn't laugh out loud, but they didn't not laugh either. Marlowe looked at Silas Crow for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned back toward the smokehouse and kept walking. "Keys on the nail by the east barn door," one of the younger hands said, and she could hear Silas turn on him immediately, but she was already moving. Garrett Blackstone found her inside the smokehouse 20 minutes later, which she suspected was exactly how long it took him to hear she had arrived and make his way across the property without appearing to rush. He was younger than she had expected. Mid-30s, maybe, with dark hair that needed cutting and the permanent squint of someone who spent most of his life looking at distances. He was not a small man, but he moved carefully, the way people move when they've broken enough things to have developed some respect for their own force. "You didn't wait at the house," he said. "You told me you needed the smokehouse running before snowfall," Marlowe said, without turning around. She was running her hand along the interior wall, checking the timber. "I wasn't going to sit on your porch and drink coffee while I could be assessing the situation." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" "I think 3 years of sitting has done more damage than you probably realize." She turned then and looked at him directly. "The fire chamber has rust damage. The venting needs to be resealed. That warped panel on the south wall is going to be a problem with smoke distribution." She paused. "None of it is unfixable. But I'll need materials, and I'll need time, and I'll need the people on this ranch to let me work without interference." Garrett looked at her for a moment in that particular way people looked at her when they were adjusting their expectations, recalibrating something. She was used to it. Usually went one of 2 ways. "You have full authority over this operation," he said. "What you need, I'll get. What you say goes. In there." He nodded toward the smokehouse. "Outside of it, you're on your own." She understood what he meant. He was not going to manage his crew for her. He was going to give her authority on paper and leave her to enforce it herself. It wasn't ideal, but it was honest, and she preferred honest. "That'll do," she said. The ranch hands were 8 in total, plus Silas, who occupied a category of his own. Their names were Denny, Cal, Rufus, Pete, 2 brothers named Hatch and Warren, who almost nobody could tell apart, a quiet older man called Dutch, who spoke maybe 12 words a day, and a boy of about 17 named Tomas, who was new enough to the ranch that he hadn't yet formed strong opinions about anything. Within the first 48 hours, Marlowe had formed opinions about all of them. Denny and Cal were followers. They would take the temperature of the room before they committed to a position. Rufus was genuinely incurious and wanted to be left alone to do his work without complications. Pete was the type who made small cutting remarks and then acted surprised when anyone noticed. The Hatch brothers followed Silas without question. Dutch was watching her in that quiet way that might be judgment or might be something else entirely. Tomas watched everything and said nothing, which Marlowe recognized as a form of intelligence. And Silas Crow had decided before she stepped off the wagon that she did not belong here, and he had decided this for reasons she had cataloged and filed away. In the part of her mind she kept for things that were true and useless to fight directly. He was not going to change his opinion because of an argument. He was not going to change it because Garrett told him to. The only thing that was going to shift, Silas Crow was undeniable evidence, and she was going to have to build that evidence one day at a time while he worked against her. She had done this before. Not here, not with these people, but the architecture was familiar. On the 3rd day, she submitted her materials list to Garrett. He looked it over, asked 2 questions, and ordered everything without pushing back on a single item. That surprised her a little. She had expected negotiation. "You wrote specifics," he said when she asked. "Quantities, grades, suppliers. Either you know exactly what you're doing or you're very good at faking it, and either way I'd rather find out after I've spent the money." "I know what I'm doing," she said. "That's what the last person said too." "What happened to the last person?" He folded the materials list and put it in his jacket pocket. "Quit after 6 weeks, said the conditions were unreasonable." "Were they?" "Probably," he said. Most things out here are. Quote. The materials arrived by the end of the first week. While she waited for them, Marlowe cleaned the smokehouse from floor to ceiling, stripped the rust from the fire chamber with tools she'd borrowed from Dutch, who lent them without comment, and started the process of documenting everything she knew about what this smokehouse was going to need to run at capacity. She kept a ledger. Detailed, specific, written in the small, precise handwriting she'd developed over years of needing to track things that other people didn't bother tracking. What wood ratios produced which smoke qualities, what temperature ranges she needed for which curing processes, how long each cut would take at various conditions. It was the kind of record-keeping that looked obsessive until the moment it saved everything, at which point it looked like genius. She had learned that the line between obsessive and genius was usually someone else's willingness to pay attention. Silas noticed the ledger. She saw him notice it one morning when she left it on the workbench while she went to check on a delivery. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it, then looked at her when she came back in a way that told her he had looked. "Something you need, Mr. Crow?" she asked. "Just making sure you're not burning the place down," he said. "The fire won't be lit for another week and a half," she said. "When it is, you're welcome to come watch. I'll explain what I'm doing if you're interested." He left without answering. She lit the first fire on a Monday, 12 days after her arrival, and the smokehouse filled with the kind of smell that Marlowe had loved since she was 9 years old, and standing in her grandmother's kitchen in eastern Tennessee, watching a process that looked like nothing from the outside and was everything on the inside. Her grandmother had not been a small woman either. She had been the kind of person who took up room and made no apologies for it, and she had taught Marlowe that the way you cure meat is the way you do everything worth doing, slowly, with attention, without shortcuts, and with enough confidence in your own knowledge that you don't need anyone else's approval to know when you've gotten it right. Marlowe thought about that now, adjusting the damper by increments, reading the smoke the way she'd been taught to read it. Color, density, movement. This was not guesswork. This was 30 years of accumulated knowledge translated into muscle memory and instinct, and it was as real and as valid as anything any of the men on this ranch knew how to do. She would have liked not to have to prove it, but she was going to prove it anyway. By the end of the second week, she had the first batch of curing brine prepared and the first cuts hanging. The brine was her grandmother's base formula, adjusted for altitude and the particular mineral content of the local water, which she had tested herself using a kit she'd brought from Billings. It was not a recipe she had written down anywhere. It was a recipe she carried in her body, in the particular way your hands know when a proportion is right before your brain has finished calculating. She caught Pete watching her work through the smokehouse window one afternoon, and she didn't acknowledge him, and after a while he went away. The next day it was the Hatch brothers, which meant Silas had sent them to report on something specific. She still didn't acknowledge them, let them look. Looking wasn't the same as understanding. The destruction happened on a Thursday morning, 17 days in. She had arrived at the smokehouse at 5:30, as she always did, to check on the overnight temperature and make any adjustments needed before the rest of the ranch was fully awake. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The brine crocks were lined up along the north shelf. The fire was holding. The smoke was moving the way she wanted. She went to the main house to get breakfast, because she'd learned that eating with the ranch hands was worth the discomfort. You learned more about people at a table than you did anywhere else. She was gone 40 minutes. When she came back, Silas Crow was walking out of the smokehouse. He didn't look at her. He walked past her without making eye contact, and there was something in his body language that was so deliberate, so composed, that she felt the bottom drop out of her stomach before she even reached the door. She walked in. The crocks were on their sides, all 8 of them. 40 pounds of brine, 3 weeks of careful preparation, soaking into the dirt floor of the smokehouse in a spreading dark stain that she stood at the edge of and stared at while her mind ran through what had just happened, and what it meant, and what she was going to do about it. She heard boots on the ground outside, multiple sets. She turned around. Silas had come back with most of the crew, Denny, Cal, Rufus, Pete, both Hatch brothers, and Tomas, who was standing at the edge of the group looking like he was not sure how he had ended up there. They were arrayed in that half circle, not aggressive exactly, but present in a way that was meant to be felt. And behind them, slightly apart, was Garrett Blackstone. Marlowe looked at Garrett. He looked back at her. His jaw was tight. His hands were in his pockets. He didn't speak. She had expected this. Not this specifically, not this particular act of destruction, but she had known something was coming, and she had known that when it came, Garrett was going to have to choose whether to act or to stand still. She had hoped he would choose to act. She had not been certain he would. He didn't. Silas said something. She would reconstruct it later. Something about the brine being improperly prepared, about the ratios being off, about how someone had done her a favor before she wasted more materials. And she heard his words the way you hear words when most of your attention is elsewhere, processing something more important. She looked at each man in that group, one by one, just for a second each, reading what was there, filing it away. Then she looked at Silas. "Thank you for your input," she said. Her voice came out level, which cost her more than she was willing to let him see. "I'll start the next batch this afternoon." She turned back into the smokehouse and began cleaning up. She heard them leave. She heard Silas say something short to the crew, and she heard boots moving away. And eventually she heard a silence that was almost complete except for the faint sound of the fire in the chamber and her own breathing. Then she heard one more set of footsteps. Quiet, deliberate. They stopped at the doorway. "Marlowe," Garrett said. She didn't turn around. She was on her knees, pressing a cloth into the wet dirt, working systematically from one side to the other. "I need to say something." "You've already said it," she said, "by not saying anything." The silence that followed lasted long enough that she thought he might leave. Then he said, "I should have stopped it." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I'll speak to Silas." "Don't." She sat back on her heels and looked at him over her shoulder. "Don't speak to him on my behalf. Don't apologize on his behalf. Don't make this a conversation about what you should have done, because the only thing that matters to me right now is the next batch of brine and the schedule I need to keep to have this smokehouse operational before snowfall." She paused. "If you want to make yourself useful, find out if the supply wagon comes through again before the end of the month. I'll need salt." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once and left. She went back to cleaning the floor. The first thing she did, after the floor was clean and the crocks were righted and washed and her hands had stopped shaking enough to trust herself, was sit down with her ledger and write down everything she had lost and everything she needed to rebuild it. She was not in the habit of crying over lost work. She had lost work before. She had lost jobs, lost contracts, lost batches, lost equipment, lost time, lost money. She had lost things because of incompetence, sometimes her own, more often other people's. And she had lost things because of deliberate sabotage. And she had lost things because of weather and circumstance and plain bad luck. Every time the only thing that mattered was the same. What do you have, and what do you need, and how do you get from one to the other? She was 38 years old. She had been doing this for 20 years. She had learned her trade from a woman who had done it for 40, and she had spent 2 decades adding to what she'd been given, refining and experimenting and making mistakes and learning from them. And she was not going to let Silas Crow or anyone else make her forget that everything she knew was still inside her exactly where it had always been. The brine formula was in her head. She would remake it. The batch would take 3 weeks, yes, and that was 3 weeks she couldn't spare easily, but she knew how to compress the schedule elsewhere, where compression was safe, and she knew where it wasn't safe, where cutting corners would ruin the product in ways that wouldn't show until it was too late. She started the new batch that afternoon. She didn't ask anyone for help. She didn't announce what she was doing. She got the materials from the supply room, and she worked in the smokehouse until the light was gone, and then she worked by lantern, and by the time she was finished, the first new crocks were sitting on the shelf, and the smell of salt and smoke and the particular mineral sharpness of good curing brine was back in the air, and Marlowe sat down on an overturned crate and let herself feel, just for a moment, exactly how tired she was. Then she got up and went to bed, because she needed to be back here by 5:30. What Silas had not counted on, and this was the thing about people who underestimated her, the thing they always got wrong, was that she had a very specific quality of stubbornness that had nothing to do with ego or pride or the desire to win an argument. It was simpler than that. She just genuinely could not make herself stop. She had tried, once, years ago, to walk away from a job when the hostility made it not worth it. She had gotten as far as packing her bag before something in her, something her grandmother would have called the knowing, told her that leaving would cost her something she would never get back. Not the job, not the money. Something else. Some essential part of the way she understood herself. She hadn't left. The job had been brutal and the outcome had been imperfect, and she had finished it, and what she carried away from it was a knowledge of herself that she would not trade for anything, because that knowledge was what she stood on when everything else was uncertain. She was standing on it now. Tomas appeared at the smokehouse door the next morning early, before the rest of the hands were visible. He was carrying a small bundle of hickory chips, the good grade kind, and he set them down just inside the door without saying anything. Marlowe looked at him. Dutch said these smoke better, Tomas said. At this altitude. He said the other grade throws too much resin. Dutch, who had lent her his tools without comment and watched her from across the yard with unreadable eyes. Tell Dutch I said thank you, Marlowe said. Tomas almost smiled. Then he left. She remade the batch in 19 days instead of 21 because she had the formula exactly right the second time, without any of the small adjustments and corrections that had taken up time in the first attempt. She had learned from the first batch, which meant the destruction had cost her 3 weeks of time, but had also, in a way she would not give Silas Crow credit for, sharpened her process. She did not share this observation with anyone. The smokehouse was running at partial capacity by the end of September, and at 3/4 capacity by the second week of October, and at full capacity just ahead of the first hard frost. This was not the schedule she had laid out in her original plan, which had assumed no catastrophic interruptions. It was a compressed, demanding, imperfect version of that schedule, achieved by starting before sunrise every day and finishing after dark and not taking a single day off and making judgment calls, hourly, about what the operation could handle and what it couldn't. She was tired in a way that had moved beyond the body and into some deeper layer, the way extreme fatigue eventually stops feeling like physical exhaustion and starts feeling like weather, just the permanent condition of the air around you. But the smokehouse was running. The first products that came out of it were not perfect. There was a slight over-smokiness in one batch of pork that she caught early enough to adjust for, and one hanging of beef that developed faster than she'd calculated because the chamber temperature had run a few degrees hot on a particularly cold night. She documented both in the ledger, with the cause, the correction, and the result. Imperfect products were data. Data was how you got to excellent. By mid-October, she was getting excellent. Garrett came to the smokehouse on a Tuesday afternoon and stood at the door the way men stood at doors when they wanted to say something but hadn't finished figuring out how. Marlowe waited. "The men," he started. "The men are fine," she said. "Tomas has been helping me 2 mornings a week. Dutch checks the wood supply. The others stay out of the way, which is all I'm asking." "And Silas?" She was quiet for a moment. "Silas stays out of the smokehouse," she said. "That's all I need from him right now." "He's been saying things," Garrett said, "to the men, about the efficiency, about whether the operation is going to be able to supply enough for the winter contracts." "Will it?" she said, and looked at him directly. He held her gaze. "I think so, but I haven't been in this business long enough to know for certain." "I have," she said. "It will. I'm running about 4 days behind the original schedule, but the quality is better than I projected, and I can make up the time before the end of the month if the weather holds." "And if it doesn't?" She set down the tool she was holding and looked at him. "Then we adjust." He was quiet again. "You don't seem worried," he said, and she couldn't quite tell whether that reassured him or bothered him. "I'm worried about 12 things at once," she said. "I just don't find it useful to look worried." He almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was more the shape of one, the suggestion, but it was the closest thing to unguarded that she had seen from him since she arrived. He left without pushing further, which she took as a kind of trust, the provisional type, the kind that got renewed or withdrawn based on evidence. She was going to give him the evidence. What she could not have anticipated, what no amount of preparation could fully account for, was Colton Briggs. She heard the name first from Pete, who mentioned it in that particular offhand way people mention things they want you to notice but don't want credit for noticing. Briggs was in town. Briggs was talking to the Hendersons about their spring contract. Briggs had been asking questions. She filed the name without comment, which frustrated Pete, which she did not feel bad about. But she listened. She had always been better at listening than people expected, partly because people tended not to guard themselves as carefully around someone they had already decided not to take seriously. Colton Briggs, as she understood him from 3 weeks of ambient information, was a cattle baron from the valley south of the Blackstone property. He ran a larger operation than Garrett's, had more capital, more men, and more connections to the buyers who mattered in this region. He had been interested in acquiring the Blackstone property for at least 2 years, a fact that Garrett had mentioned once and not elaborated on. And he had been watching Garrett's struggles the way you watch something you expect to be yours eventually, with patience and the occasional prod to make sure the falling was still happening on schedule. The arrival of an outside woman at the Blackstone smokehouse, an outsider, a heavy woman, someone who immediately drew skepticism from the local men, was exactly the kind of detail Briggs would find useful. Not because it mattered in itself, but because gossip was a tool like any other, and the right story told to the right people at the right moment could do damage that was hard to trace back to its source. She didn't know yet exactly what story Briggs was telling, but she knew one was being told. She could feel it in the way the supply wagon driver looked at her when he made his delivery in mid-October. She could feel it in the way the man at the hardware exchange in Havre, when she made a trip for additional materials, asked her twice whether she was sure she had the right order, and made a point of confirming the Blackstone Ranch name with a particular expression. Someone was talking. Marlowe added it to her list of things to watch, and went back to work. The night that tested everything came without real warning, which was the nature of the tests that mattered. She had been watching the sky for 2 days because the sky in the Montana highlands in late October had a particular look before a serious storm, a kind of flattened yellowish quality in the afternoon light that her grandmother would have called the brass sky. You learned to read it if you lived in places like this long enough. Marlowe had not lived here long, but she had spent 20 years in high country, and she knew the sky was telling her something she needed to listen to. She moved as much of the operation as she could before the storm hit, checked the venting, secured the dampers, made sure the fire chamber had enough fuel to run through whatever was coming without requiring her to open the door to the outside more than absolutely necessary. She adjusted the hanging positions of everything currently in process, accounting for the way cold could move through even a well-sealed structure if the temperature dropped fast enough. She was as prepared as she could be. The storm came in at 3 in the morning, which was either very unlucky or very lucky depending on how you looked at it. Unlucky because it arrived in the darkest, coldest part of the night. Lucky because she had not yet gone to sleep, having stayed in the smokehouse to watch the fire and wait. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in under 2 hours. She felt it first as a change in the fire's behavior, the draft shifting as the pressure outside changed, and then as a physical reality in her own body, the cold working its way through the smokehouse walls in a way that a good structure could resist but not defeat entirely. She worked. She moved constantly, because stopping meant the cold got to her faster. She monitored the chamber temperature by the feel of the air and by the behavior of the smoke, making adjustments by degrees, watching for the signs that the hanging meat was in danger. If the temperature inside dropped below a certain threshold, the brine chemistry would be disrupted. She would lose batches. She might lose most of what she had built over the last 2 months. She was not going to lose it. Her arms ached. Her back ached. At some point around 4 in the morning, she knocked over a crock of salt and spent 10 minutes on her knees collecting as much of it as she could salvage, and she was aware, distantly, that this was a ridiculous thing to be doing in the dark, in the middle of a Montana blizzard, and she almost laughed, and then she almost cried, and she did neither because she didn't have time. She just kept working. Garrett found her at 5:45, when the sky outside was beginning to lighten from black to something that might eventually be gray. He came in through the smokehouse door, which was an act of some courage because the door had iced at the hinges and required his full shoulder to open, and he stood inside for a moment looking at her. She was standing at the fire chamber with her coat on over her work clothes, and her hair loose because she had not bothered to pin it. And her face was smudged with smoke, and she was reading the damper with her hand the way her grandmother had taught her, and she had almost forgotten he was there within about 4 seconds. "You've been here all night," he said. "The temperature dropped too fast," she said. "Somebody had to watch it." He moved to stand beside her. Not in front of her, not in the way of her work, but beside her, in the spot where the second set of hands would stand if there were 2 people running this chamber. He looked at what she was looking at. "Tell me what to do," he said. She glanced at him. "Tell me what to do," he said again, "and I'll do it." So she told him, and he did it. He was not skilled. He was learning from scratch in the worst possible conditions, with the most at stake. But he was not stupid. and he was not slow. And he listened exactly as carefully as she told him to listen, and made the adjustments she described with a precision that told her his hands knew how to be careful, even when his mind was new to the task. They worked side by side until the sun was fully up, and the storm had moved east, and the temperature inside the smokehouse had climbed back to safe range, and every batch hanging on every shelf was intact. Marlowe stood back and looked at it, all of it. Every cut, every hanging, every crock. She had not lost a single thing. She sat down on the overturned crate, which she was beginning to think of as her chair, and she put her face in her hands for a moment. Not crying, just breathing. Just letting herself be in the body that had done this work and feel, for one unguarded moment, the size of what it had cost. When she looked up, Garrett was watching her. "I'm going to bring the Henderson brothers here," he said, "and the Calloway family. And whoever else needs to see what's on these shelves before they listen to another word Briggs says about this operation." Marlowe looked at him. "You saved this ranch tonight," he said, "and I'm not going to let anyone pretend otherwise." She was too tired to respond the way she might have responded with more sleep and more resources. She just nodded, once. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll watch the fire until Dutch comes on." She stood up. Her legs were less reliable than she would have liked. She walked past him toward the door, and she had her hand on it when he said her name. She stopped, didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," he said. "About the first morning, I should have stopped him." "You should have," she said. "I won't make that mistake again." She didn't answer. She pushed the door open and walked out into the cold morning air, and the snow was still falling lightly, and the Blackstone Ranch was quiet around her, and somewhere behind her the smokehouse was still running, and everything she had built was still standing. For now, that was enough. She slept 4 hours. That was not a choice she made so much as a fact that happened to her. She was horizontal for 4 hours, and then she was awake. Not gradually, but completely, the way she always woke when there was work she hadn't finished. Her body had its own accounting system, and it was telling her the books weren't closed. She lay still for about 30 seconds, running through the smokehouse in her mind. Fire chamber, hanging schedule, brine crocks, temperature variance from the storm. 4 hours of sleep, and her brain was already back at the workbench, checking inventory. She got up. Dutch was at the smokehouse door when she arrived, as promised, sitting on a crate outside it with his coat buttoned to the collar and a cup of something steaming in his hands. He looked at her when she walked up. Didn't say anything about the 4 hours. Didn't say anything about the night. He just stood, handed her the cup. It was coffee, black, exactly what she needed, and walked back toward the bunkhouse. She stood at the door and drank it. The storm had left about 3 inches of snow on the ground and a hard-packed crust on everything above it. The sky was clear now in that particular way after a bad storm, washed out and pale and very large. The ranch was quiet. Smoke came from the main house chimney. In the distance, one of the Hatch brothers was breaking ice in the water troughs, the sound of it carrying cleanly in the cold air. Marlowe finished the coffee, set the cup on the crate, and went inside to check her work. Everything was as she had left it. Better than she had left it, actually. The chamber had settled into a steady burn sometime in the early morning, and the temperature inside had climbed to ideal range and held there, which meant the most critical phase of 2 separate batches had progressed through the night exactly as it was supposed to. She moved through the space methodically, touching, checking, reading the air with her nose the way you could only do after years of knowing what you were smelling for. She allowed herself, quietly and without ceremony, to feel that she had won something. Not the war. Definitely not the war. But something. Oh. Tomas showed up an hour later, which was earlier than his usual 2 mornings a week arrangement, and he came in without asking and went directly to the task she hadn't assigned him yet, restacking the hickory chips that had been disturbed during the storm, and did it without instruction, which told her he had been paying more attention than she'd realized. She watched him work for a moment. He was 17, maybe 18, with the kind of seriousness about him that came either from a difficult background or from a genuine love of doing things correctly. She hadn't figured out which yet. "How long have you been on this ranch?" she asked. 4 months, he said without stopping the restacking. "Before that?" "My uncle's place, outside of Great Falls," he paused. "Smaller than this." "You know anything about preservation work?" "No," he said, "but I learn fast." She considered this. Then she said, "Come back after lunch. I'll show you how to read the chamber temperature without a gauge." He looked at her then, and whatever he'd been keeping contained in his expression shifted just slightly. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to the chips. She didn't correct the ma'am. Some battles weren't worth fighting, and some forms of respect you just accepted. Word of what had happened during the storm moved through the ranch. The way things moved through small operations, quickly and with embellishment. By the time she heard it reflected back to her through Tomas and Dutch and a brief, uncomfortable conversation with Rufus near the supply barn, the story had acquired a dramatic shape that she didn't entirely recognize, mostly because, in the version that was circulating, she had single-handedly held the smokehouse against a blizzard while the rest of the ranch slept, which was not wrong exactly, but also wasn't quite the whole picture. The whole picture included 4 hours of exhausting, unglamorous, muscle-aching work in the dark and cold, multiple near mistakes that she had caught barely in time, and a profound amount of fear that she had not let herself feel fully until it was over. But the version that circulated was cleaner and more useful, and she let it circulate. Silas heard the story too. She knew because his behavior changed, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else might have read clearly, but she had been watching him carefully enough that the shift was visible. He stopped making comments in her proximity. He stopped sending the Hatch brothers to observe her work and report back. He stayed in his own lane, which was the main cattle operation, and he did his job and she did hers, and for about a week there was an uneasy, wordless truce that neither of them acknowledged directly. She did not trust it. Truces like this one had a tendency to last exactly as long as it took for the person who had lost the first round to find a better angle. She was right to not trust it. The news about Colton Briggs came in the second week of November, in the form of a conversation she was not supposed to hear. She had gone to the supply barn to check a delivery that had come in that morning, and she was in the back of the barn, behind a stack of feed sacks, when she heard Pete and one of the Hatch brothers, she still couldn't tell which one by voice, come in through the main door. They didn't know she was there. She knew this because they kept talking. "Briggs was in Havre yesterday," Pete said, talking to the Calloway brothers about the spring contracts. "They already signed with Blackstone," Hatch said. "They signed a letter of intent. That's not the same thing." Pete's voice had that careful tone it got when he was repeating something he hadn't thought of himself. "Briggs is telling people Garrett handed the ranch's food operation to some overweight drifter who wandered in from Billings. Says she has no credentials and no experience, and the whole thing's going to fall apart before spring." A pause. "Well," Hatch said slowly, "he's saying Garrett's judgment has gone sideways. That a man who'd hire someone like that to run his winter supply operation can't be trusted with a long-term contract." Another pause. Longer. "The stuff she's been putting out's pretty good," Hatch said finally, and she heard in his voice the particular discomfort of a man being asked to agree with something his own experience had already partially contradicted. "That pork from last week? Briggs doesn't know what she's been putting out," Pete said. "Neither do the Callaways. All they know is what Briggs is telling them." She stayed very still behind the feed sacks. "What's he want?" Hatch said. "Probably wants the Callaways to hold off on signing anything formal until spring. Let the contracts float. If Garrett comes out of winter in good shape, they sign. If he doesn't..." Pete left it unfinished in that deliberate way that was its own kind of sentence. She heard them move toward the back of the barn to deal with the delivery, and she slipped out the side door before they reached her. She stood in the cold outside and let the information settle. Briggs was not attacking the smokehouse directly. He couldn't, because he didn't have enough knowledge of its actual performance to make specific accusations. He was attacking Garrett's judgment, using her as the instrument of that attack, which was smarter, harder to defend against. You could produce records and samples to disprove technical accusations. It was much harder to disprove a story about a man's character. She needed Garrett to know, and she needed to think carefully about how to tell him. She told him that evening, after dinner, in the main house kitchen, because that was where she had established the habit of reporting on the smokehouse's progress, and it was the most private room on the ranch at that hour. She told him plainly, without editorial, just the facts of what she had heard, and from whom, and what conclusions she'd drawn. Garrett listened without interrupting. He was sitting at the table with his hands around a cup of coffee, and his face did the thing it did when he was thinking seriously. Not blank exactly, but contained, all the processing happening somewhere she couldn't see it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I expected this," he he said. I know, she said, but expecting it and dealing with it aren't the same thing. No, he agreed. They're not. The contracts that matter are the ones with the Henderson brothers and the Calloway family, she said. I don't know them. You do. What they need to believe is that what's coming out of this smokehouse is worth more than whatever Briggs is offering them. What's coming out of this smokehouse is worth more, he said. I know that. You know that. They don't know that yet. She set down her cup. Invite them here. Both families. Let them come into the smokehouse and look at the operation and taste the product. Let them see the records. She tapped the ledger she'd brought with her to the table. They're businessmen. They'll make a decision based on what they see with their own eyes if you give them the chance. He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. You're not worried about them seeing your methods? Other ranches could benefit from knowing how you work. Other ranches can't replicate what I do by reading my ledger, she said. The knowledge is in the hands. It takes years to develop. The ledger just shows them that I'm doing this systematically, not by guesswork. He picked up the ledger and opened it, and she watched him read it the way he'd never had occasion to read it before. Not for information, but for its shape, for what it said about the person who had written it. I'll reach out to them this week, he said. She nodded and stood up to leave. Marlowe. He said her name in that way he had, plain and direct. Does Silas know Briggs is talking? She thought about it. Probably, she said. I don't know if he's feeding Briggs information or just benefiting from the same current. Garrett's jaw tightened slightly. I'll handle Silas. I told you, but I know what you told me, but this is different. This is about the ranch's contracts, and that's my problem to manage. He paused. I'll handle it without making it about you. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, All right, and left. She was in the smokehouse before 5 the next morning, and she did something she had not allowed herself to do since the first week on the ranch. She slowed down. Not in her work, the work continued at exactly its required pace, but in her attention. She let herself notice things she had been too exhausted or too embattled to notice before. The particular way the hickory smoke moved in the upper part of the chamber, the almost visible layering of it in the cold air. The sound the fire made in the early morning, which was different from the sound it made at midday in a way that she had never been able to fully explain but had always been able to use. The weight of the ledger in her hand when she carried it. The way a properly cured cut of beef smelled different from one that was almost right. A difference that lived completely in the nose and could not be translated into any other language. She had not chosen this life because it was the easiest thing available to her. She had chosen it because it was the only thing that felt like using herself fully, all of herself. All the attention and knowledge and patience she had pointed at something that mattered. You couldn't fake it. You couldn't shortcut it. You couldn't charm your way through it or argue your way around it. The product either was what it was supposed to be or it wasn't, and that was the only verdict that counted. She had missed that clarity. The last few months had been so full of human complications that she hadn't had enough uninterrupted time to simply be good at her work and know it. She made herself an hour of that clarity, moving through the smokehouse with full attention and no other agenda. Then Tomas arrived, and she put her teacher's hat back on. Ochak. Teaching Tomas was not something she had planned for. It had happened the way things happened on working ranches, out of necessity and then out of genuine interest before she quite realized the shift had occurred. He was a good student in the specific way that mattered. He noticed things, and he asked questions only after he had tried to figure out the answer himself. And when he was wrong, he absorbed the correction without ego getting in the way. He had the physical patience for this kind of work, which not everyone did. The ability to hold position and attention at a fire chamber for long stretches without fidgeting or disengaging. And he smelled things. He would walk past a hanging batch and his head would turn slightly, and he would come back to it, and usually there was something there worth coming back to. How do you know when it's done? He asked her one morning, standing in front of a side of beef that had 3 more days on its scheduled cycle. I don't use the schedule as the answer, she said. I use it as a guess. The answer is the product. So how do you read the product? Smell it, she said. He did. He leaned in close, which took a certain lack of self-consciousness that she respected, and he took a slow breath. It's, he started. Don't describe it, she said. Just remember it. That's what it smells like now. When it's done, It'll smell different. Not dramatically, just differently. Deeper. Like it finished settling into itself. She paused. Come back in 3 days and smell it again. Then you'll know what I mean. He came back in 3 days. He smelled it. Oh, he said. Yeah, she said. Ota. The conversation between Garrett and Silas happened somewhere she didn't witness, but she knew it had happened because Silas came to the smokehouse door the following Thursday. He stood outside it, not crossing the threshold, which she noticed. She waited. I need to know the production schedule, he said, for the winter. She looked at him. Why? Because if we're going to have enough product for the spring contracts, I need to know what's coming and when, so I can plan the herd accordingly. He said it like it cost him something. Not an apology, nothing close to one, but a statement of operational fact that required him to acknowledge her role in the operation's logistics. She pulled the production schedule from her ledger and held it out. He came forward and took it, read it, and handed it back. The third week of November looks light, he said. I'm running a maintenance cycle on the chamber. It needs to be done or the output quality degrades in December. He was quiet for a moment. How many days does it take? 4, 5 if something needs replacing. Can you do it earlier in the month, before the 15th? She thought about it. It was a real question, not a challenge. She could do it earlier. There was enough flexibility in the current batch cycle. Moving the maintenance window would require some adjustment, but nothing she couldn't manage. Probably, she said. I'll look at the cycle and let you know tomorrow. He nodded, started to leave. Crow, she said. He stopped, turned. She held his gaze for a moment. She was not going to offer him grace she didn't feel, and she was not going to manufacture a moment of reconciliation for the sake of making things easier in the short term. But she was also not going to waste an opening. I can move the maintenance window, she said, but I need you to stop feeding Colton Briggs. He went very still. I don't know whether you're telling him things directly or whether you've just been complaining to people who pass things on, she continued, but it stops. The ranch's contracts depend on what comes out of this smokehouse, and the smokehouse's reputation depends on not having its own people undermining it to competitors. She paused. I don't need you to like me. I need you to let the work speak. The silence between them was long and not comfortable. She held it without filling it. I haven't spoken to Briggs, he said finally. She believed this was mostly true. Then I need whoever has to stop. He didn't respond to that directly. He just said, I'll look for your note about the maintenance window, and left. It was not the conversation she would have written if she were writing the story of her own life, but it was the conversation that had actually happened, and she put it in the ledger of things she knew to be true. Silas Crow was a complicated, proud, difficult man who was not fully her enemy and was not yet her ally, and who was capable of operating professionally when his options were limited. That was more than she'd had a month ago. She would take it. She moved the maintenance window to the 10th of November, and she completed it in 4 days, and by the 14th, the smokehouse was back at full operation with every system running better than before. She documented every repair, every replacement, every calibration adjustment, with before and after temperature readings, noted in the ledger beside each entry. The ledger was getting thick. She was starting to need a second one. Garrett came to look at the smokehouse 3 more times that month, always at different hours, always without announcement. She had stopped being surprised by these visits and had started being, not quite grateful, but something in the same neighborhood. He wasn't inspecting her work. He was learning what her work was. There was a difference, and she had begun to feel it. On his 3rd visit, he brought a question that she hadn't expected. The Henderson brothers are coming on the 22nd, he said. I'd like you there. In what capacity? She asked. In the capacity of the person who knows more about what's on those shelves than anyone else on this property, he said. She looked at him. You want me to talk to them directly? Yes. Not just have my work be the argument. Your work will be most of the argument, he said, but I want you there. She thought about this. Meeting buyers, making the case for her own operation, to men who had already heard Colton Briggs' version of what this operation was. It was a different kind of exposure than anything the ranch hand's skepticism had required. This was professional and financial, and it mattered in a concrete, documented way. All right, she said, but I won't perform for them. He looked puzzled. What do you mean? I mean, I'll show them what I do and explain it and answer questions honestly. I won't dress it up or make it dramatic or pretend I haven't had problems. She met his eyes. If they're worth doing business with, the truth will be enough. He held her gaze for a moment. I think it will be, he said. Oh. The Henderson brothers arrived on the 22nd, as scheduled. They were two men in their late 50s. Roy, who was thick-necked and had the manner of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room and occasionally wrong about this, and Dell, who was quieter and watched everything with an attention that Marlowe recognized as the practical intelligence that outlasted most other kinds. Garrett brought them to the smokehouse, and Marlowe was already there, and she did not shake their hands immediately, but instead said, "Come in, I'll show you what I've been building." She showed them everything, not a presentation. She did not have slides or a speech or a planned sequence. She just walked them through the space the way she worked in it, explaining each thing as she reached it, the same way she would have explained it to Tomas. The fire chamber and its logic, the hanging system and why the positions mattered, the brine crocks and what was in them, the maintenance records, the temperature logs. Dell Henderson asked 5 questions, all of them specific and technical, and she answered each one fully and without hedging. Roy Henderson asked 2 questions, both of which were really one question dressed differently. Can this operation sustain the volume we need? She answered the question underneath both of them. Yes, here is why. Here are the numbers. Then she opened the curing cabinet and she let them taste. The silence that followed was the best kind. Not awkward, evaluative. Both men took their time. Dell tasted 3 separate items and went back to the first one. Roy set down the second thing he tried and picked it up again. This is better than what we've been getting from the Briggs operation, Roy said finally, not to Marlowe, but to his brother. Considerably, Dell said. Briggs has been telling people, Roy started. I know what Briggs has been telling people, Marlowe said. You can look at those records and form your own opinion. Roy looked at her then, and something in his expression recalibrated slightly. Not quite respect yet, but the beginning of the process that led there. Who taught you this? Dell asked. My grandmother, Marlowe said, and 20 years of making mistakes and learning from them. Dell nodded slowly. That's the right answer, he said. They signed the formal contract with Garrett 2 days later. Marlowe was not present for the signing because she had 3 batches in critical phase and she did not leave critical batches. But Garrett came and told her that evening, and she said good, and went back to what she was doing, and he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary before he left. The news about the Henderson contract reached the other ranchers in the valley, the way all news reached people in isolated places, faster than it should have been possible. By the end of the week, she heard through Tomas that the Calloway family had asked to visit. She heard through Dutch that a third rancher she'd never met, a woman named Patrice Dumont, who ran a sheep operation 30 miles east, had sent a note to Garrett asking whether the smokehouse was taking outside contracts. She was not taking outside contracts. She had more than enough to manage for the Blackstone operation through winter, but she took note of the name. The shift was happening, not dramatically, not all at once. Shifts in the real world almost never happened all at once, despite what the stories people told later implied. But it was happening in the way that things happened when results were allowed to be results. Incrementally, undeniably, one piece of evidence building on another until the accumulation was too heavy to argue with. Silas said nothing, but he stopped looking at her the way he had been looking at her. Pete said nothing either, but one afternoon she found him in the smokehouse asking Tomas a question about the hanging schedule. Not to make trouble, but because he actually wanted to know. She pretended not to notice, which was the kindest thing she could do for both of them. The Calloway visit came on the 30th of November, and it went much the same way as the Henderson visit, with the small difference that the elder Calloway, a woman named Rosalie, who ran the family business since her husband's death 3 years earlier, arrived with more prior knowledge than the Henderson brothers had. She had done her research. She asked questions that told Marlowe she had already talked to people who knew something about preservation work, and she pushed on the points where Marlowe's answers were incomplete. And when she got a complete answer, she nodded once and moved on. At the end, Rosalie Calloway looked at Garrett and said, "You should have put a partnership arrangement in front of this woman 3 months ago." Garrett looked at Marlowe. Marlowe looked at Rosalie Calloway. "I'm an employee," Marlowe said carefully. "You're running the operation that is going to determine whether this ranch has a future," Rosalie said, with the directness of a woman who had stopped moderating herself for other people's comfort, somewhere in her 40s, and never gone back. "An employee can leave." A partner has skin in the game. She looked at Garrett again. Think about it. She left with the promise of a formal contract by the new year, and Marlowe stood in the smokehouse after she was gone and turned the word over in her mind. Partner. She had not come to this ranch thinking about partnership. She had come thinking about a job. A difficult one, a meaningful one, but a job. Something with an end date, a wage, a departure. She had been doing that her whole working life, arriving in places, doing hard things, leaving when the work was finished or the welcome was over, whichever came first. She had not let herself think past this winter. She had been too busy surviving it. But the smokehouse was on its third month of operation, and the shelves were full, and the records were meticulous, and the Henderson brothers and the Calloway family, and possibly Patrice Dumont 30 miles east had seen those shelves and those records and made decisions accordingly. And the man who owned this ranch had stood beside her in a blizzard at 5 in the morning and done exactly what she told him and not asked for credit for it. She was not ready to think about what that added up to. Not yet. She picked up the ledger and made her entry for the day. The work was not finished. Winter was not over. There were batches in process that needed her attention, and a maintenance cycle in December that she'd been planning since November, and the spring contracts would need documentation she hadn't started yet. But somewhere underneath the work, in a part of herself she had been keeping quiet for the sake of getting through each day, something had changed its position, shifted, settled into something that felt less like an argument she was still having and more like a ground she had already won, even if no one had officially said so. She closed the ledger. She had a smokehouse to run. The second ledger arrived from the supply wagon on the 1st of December, and Marlowe filled the first page that same evening. She had not planned to be this meticulous. When she started the ledger system back in September, it had been purely practical, a way to keep the production schedule organized in her own mind, to track variables and outcomes and not repeat the same mistakes twice. But somewhere in the months since, the ledger had become something else as well. A record. A document of everything that had happened in the Blackstone smokehouse since she arrived, written in her own hand, in her own words, with her own observations attached. She was not sure yet what she was building toward, but she wrote it all down anyway, because her grandmother had once told her that the most important things were always the ones nobody thought to document until it was too late. Outside the smokehouse window, December announced itself with a sky the color of old pewter, and a wind that had no patience for anything standing in its way. The days had shortened to the point where she was starting work in full dark and finishing in nearly full dark again, the light appearing for a grudging few hours in the middle and then retreating. This was the part of winter that separated the people who had chosen to be here from the people who had ended up here. You had to have made a decision about cold and dark, somewhere in your history, or the Montana Highlands in December would make the decision for you. Marlowe had made that decision a long time ago. She did not love the cold, but she respected what it demanded, which was close enough. What? Tomas had become her shadow in the best possible sense, present when presence was useful, absent when it wasn't, and developing fast enough that she had started giving him responsibility instead of just instruction. He could read the chamber temperature now without the gauge, most of the time getting within 2 degrees of the actual reading, which was better than some people she'd worked with for years. He was starting to develop a nose for the smoke, which was the harder skill, the one that couldn't be fully taught, because the final translation happened somewhere between the smell and the brain in a way that was entirely individual. He made mistakes. She corrected them without dramatics, and he didn't make the same mistake twice, which was the quality she cared about most. On the 4th of December, she gave him his first solo responsibility, monitoring the overnight temperature on a batch that was in a stable phase and didn't require any active intervention, just observation and a single note in the log. She was 50 yards away in her sleeping quarters the whole time, which they both knew, but the responsibility was real. If something changed, the first decision was his. Nothing changed. He logged the temperature correctly every 2 hours, noted a minor draft variation at 3 in the morning that he had identified and checked the source of without waking her, and handed her the log in the morning with the quiet competence of someone who has discovered they are capable of more than they thought. She read the log. She made no comment about the draft. He'd handled it correctly, and saying so would make it a bigger deal than it needed to be. "Good work," she said. "Same shift next week." He nodded, and she went back to what she was doing, and that was that. The tension she had been expecting from Colton Briggs arrived in a form she hadn't anticipated. She had been expecting another round of rumors, more social pressure on the Valley's ranchers, maybe a direct approach to Garrett designed to reopen the contract negotiations that Briggs had lost when the Hendersons and Callaways signed. She had been preparing her arguments accordingly, keeping her record sharp, making sure every product that left the smokehouse was documented in enough detail that no reasonable person could question its quality. What she had not been expecting was for Briggs to show up at the ranch in person. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, in a wagon that was several grades nicer than anything at Blackstone Ranch, with two men riding alongside it who were not doing anything except being large and being visible. She watched the wagon come up the road from the smokehouse window without moving from her position at the fire chamber, because the fire was at a point that required her attention, and whatever Briggs was doing, it could wait until she was finished. She had still not met Colton Briggs. She had formed a detailed picture of him from ambient information, the way people talked about him, the way they didn't talk about him when they thought they should be careful, the specific quality of the respect he commanded, which was closer to wariness than admiration. He was a man who had built something large and wanted more, which was a recognizable type. The variation in that type that mattered was whether the wanting was principled or indifferent. She suspected Briggs was the indifferent variety. She finished the task at the fire chamber, made her log entry, and walked to the main house. Garrett was in the front room with Briggs, and the conversation had already developed a shape by the time she appeared in the doorway. Briggs was seated, which was either a comfort thing or a power move. Seated put you at eye level with someone standing. It took the height differential off the table. He was maybe 50. Built in the way of men who had once been physically powerful and were now powerful in a different way that was more about money and less about their own bodies. His clothes were good. His face was well maintained. His eyes were doing what she recognized as real-time assessment. They moved to her the moment she appeared. "Ms. Bennett," Garrett said, and she understood from the way he said it that he had been waiting for her. "Colton Briggs." Briggs did not stand. He looked at her with the kind of expression that tried to present itself as neutral and wasn't quite. "I've been hearing a great deal about you," he said. His voice was the type that sounded reasonable even when it wasn't. "I've been hearing a great deal about you as well," she said. She sat down at the table without being invited, across from him, which was not an accident. He almost smiled. "All bad, I'm sure." "No," she said honestly. "You run a successful operation. That's not nothing." She looked at him directly. "You also run a successful rumor campaign, which I find less impressive." The almost smile held for a moment and then settled into something else. He glanced at Garrett. "Your employee is direct." "I've noticed," Garrett said. "I'm curious about something," Briggs said, returning his attention to Marlowe. "This smokehouse of yours, you've been running it, 3 months?" "Closer to 4. And already you've convinced the Hendersons and the Callaways to commit their contracts." He said it without heat, just as a fact he was laying on the table. "That's impressive, assuming the product holds." "The product holds," she said. "I only have your word for that so far. You have the Henderson brothers' word, and Rosalie Callaway's word, and the word of everyone on this ranch who's been eating what comes out of that smokehouse since October." She held his gaze. "But I understand if that's not sufficient for you." Briggs was quiet for a moment. The two men who had ridden alongside his wagon were somewhere outside. She'd noticed them staying out when Briggs went in, which told her they were escorts and not advisors. This was a conversation Briggs was having on his own, which meant it mattered to him in a personal way. "I'm going to make Garrett an offer," Briggs said, and something in the room shifted slightly, the way air shifts before a change in weather. "A fair one. For the ranch and the operation both." Garrett said nothing. He was very still. "I've wanted this property for 2 years," Briggs continued, "and I'm prepared to offer a price that reflects what it would be worth under better management." A pause. "No offense intended to the current arrangement." Marlowe looked at Garrett. Garrett was looking at Briggs. "I'm not selling," Garrett said. "You're also not in a financial position to be categorical about that," Briggs said, and his voice stayed perfectly reasonable, which was the most dangerous version of a threat. "The last 2 winters were hard here. I know what your debt situation looks like, Garrett. Most people in this valley do." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happened when something true and unwelcome had been said in a room. "I think you should hear the number," Briggs said. "I said no," Garrett said. "Once. That's all the times I'm going to say it." Briggs looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Marlowe. The assessment in his eyes was something she had been the subject of for her entire professional life, but this version of it was different. Not the assessment of a man looking for a reason to dismiss her, but the assessment of a man trying to figure out what she was worth in a calculation he was still running. "Your operation changes the picture somewhat," he said to her directly. "I won't pretend otherwise." "Good," she said. "That was the intention." He looked at her for another moment, and then he stood, and the sitting as power move resolved itself into him, being a tall man who moved with the deliberate ease of someone who was used to being the one who decided when things ended. "I'll show myself out," he said to Garrett. "The offer stands. Think about it." He left. The sound of his wagon leaving the property took about 2 minutes to fully fade. Garrett put his elbows on the table and pressed both hands against his forehead. Marlowe waited. "He's not wrong about the debt," Garrett said, without moving his hands. "Last 2 years were bad. I borrowed against the property to keep the herd alive through both winters." "I know," she said. He looked up. "How?" "Because it was obvious," she said, not unkindly. "The way you responded to my materials list in September. The fact that you hired me at all instead of just closing the smokehouse for another year. The look on your face when I told you about the Henderson brothers signing." She paused. "The math isn't hard to read, Garrett. The smokehouse is the thing that makes the rest of it work. You knew that before I got here." He looked at her for a long moment. "If those spring contracts come through, I can clear enough of the debt that Briggs's position gets a lot weaker." "Then let's make sure they come through," she said. She stood up to go back to the smokehouse. "He's going to come back," Garrett said. "Briggs, he doesn't stop." "I know," she said. "We'll deal with it when he does." She had known, since October, that the real test of the smokehouse was not going to be the autumn batches or even the storm. The real test was the full weight of winter, when the cold was not a drama but a constant, when the work was not about surviving a crisis but about maintaining quality over the long grind of 2 months when everything was harder and slower and more exhausting. And the temptation to cut corners was at its greatest because cutting corners was almost invisible in conditions where everything already looked rough. She did not cut corners. She was meticulous to the point where Tomas, who had become meticulous himself, occasionally asked her why a particular step was necessary when the outcome seemed the same without it. She always answered the question because it was always a real question and he deserved a real answer, and because the answer was always the same at its core, because the outcome looks the same until the moment it doesn't, and by then you've already lost something you can't get back. December moved the way December moved in the Highlands, slowly in the cold and fast in retrospect. She added pages to the second ledger. She completed the maintenance cycle she'd planned, on schedule, in 4 days exactly. She started a new batch with a modified brine formula she'd been developing since October, adjusting for what she'd learned about the specific water table of this property and the way the altitude affected the chemistry. The formula wasn't perfect yet. She noted its shortcomings in the ledger and planned the next adjustment. Garrett came by most evenings, not always for long. Sometimes he had a specific question about the production schedule or the inventory. Sometimes he had no stated reason at all, and she had stopped pretending he needed one. He was a man who was learning something, and what he was learning was this specific operation, which was appropriate given that his ranch's survival depended on it. He was also, she had begun to notice, a man who was lonely in the particular way of people who have spent a long time being responsible for everything and haven't had many people to think alongside. She didn't say this. It wasn't her business. But she noticed it, and she filed it away. The second storm of the season hit on the 15th of December, and this one was not a surprise. She had been watching the sky for 4 days, had moved up the maintenance cycle on the venting system by a week, had redistributed the hanging batches to account for the fact that this storm, based on everything the sky was telling her, was going to be slower and more sustained than the October event. It was. It came in at mid-afternoon rather than the middle of the night, which was marginally better because at least she had light to work in for the first several hours. The temperature dropped steadily over 6 hours rather than all at once, which was both easier and harder. Easier because she could respond to it gradually, harder because the sustained pressure required constant attention for a longer period without the adrenaline spike of a sudden emergency to carry her through it. The ranch hands helped this time, which was new, not with the smokehouse itself, that remained her territory, but with the perimeter, Dutch and Rufus reinforced the exterior wall on the north side, where the wind was finding gaps, and the Hatch brothers brought additional fuel without being asked and stacked it within easy reach of the door. And Tomas was inside with her through most of the worst of it, doing exactly what she told him exactly when she told him, which was worth more than she had adequate words for. Silas appeared at the door somewhere around 8 o'clock in the evening, when the storm was at its loudest. He stood outside, looking in. She was at the fire chamber, and she glanced at him and went back to what she was doing. "Temperature holding?" he asked. "Holding," she said. A pause. Then, "What do you need?" She thought about it honestly, running through the checklist in her mind. "The south vent is running about 15 degrees cooler than I want. If someone can add blocking on the exterior, not permanently, just a windbreak on the south wall, it would help." "I'll do it," he said, and left. 20 minutes later, the temperature variance on the south side evened out. She noted the time and the reading in the ledger. She did not make a thing of it. When Silas came back to check, she just said the temperature had corrected, and he nodded, and that was the entire conversation. But it was a different silence than the one they'd been living in since October. She could feel the difference, even if she couldn't name it precisely. The storm lasted 36 hours. When it finally moved east and left behind a stillness that seemed vast after the noise, Marlowe walked out of the smokehouse and stood in the new snow and breathed air that was so cold it hurt the inside of her nose, and she stood there for a full minute just doing that, breathing, feeling the cold, being outside in a world that had just tried its best and had not succeeded in taking anything from her. She had lost one batch. One. A small hanging of lamb that had been in an early phase and vulnerable to the temperature shift that had occurred in the first 2 hours of the storm before she'd had time to fully compensate. She'd pulled it herself when she knew it was compromised, logged it, and set it aside. It was not ruined for all uses. It could be redirected to the ranch's immediate consumption rather than the preservation inventory. But it was off the spring contract schedule, and she had already mapped the adjustment. One batch. Out of everything on those shelves. She stood in the snow and let herself count what was still there. The same way you counted after something bad. Not what you'd lost, but what you still had. Garrett found her standing there. He came from the main house with 2 cups and he handed her one without asking, the same way Dutch had done on the morning after the first storm, which she had begun to understand was a ranch language for something that didn't have a direct verbal equivalent. "One batch," she said before he could ask. "I saw the log," he said. "Tomas left it on the house porch. It was lamb, early phase. I'd have done the same if it had been a clear night, honestly. I had it positioned wrong for this temperature range. I learned something." She drank the coffee. "The rest is fine. Better than fine. Some of it." He stood beside her in the snow and drank his coffee and looked at the sky, which had gone from storm gray to the particular brittle blue of cold, clear air after weather. "Rosalie Calloway sent a message," he said. "Wants to visit before the new year. Says she has a friend who runs an operation in Helena who she wants to bring." Marlowe absorbed this. Helena was the territorial capital. An operation there meant volume, distribution, a level of commercial scale that was different from the Valley contracts. "What kind of operation?" she asked. "Hotel and restaurant supply," Garrett said. "Large. She didn't give me more than that." Marlowe turned the coffee cup in her hands. The implications were not small. A supply contract with a hotel and restaurant distributor in Helena would be a different order of magnitude than the spring contracts currently on the table. It would also require a kind of sustained output and quality consistency that she was not certain the current setup could handle without expansion. "Tell her yes," Marlowe said. Garrett looked at her. "You're sure? If we can't deliver..." "I'll know in one meeting whether we can deliver," she said. "If we can't, I'll say so. But we won't know without the meeting." He looked at her for another moment. There was something in his expression that she had learned to read over the past months. Not quite admiration, because admiration had a self-conscious quality that wasn't right. More like recognition. The particular look of a person who keeps finding that the ground they're standing on is more solid than they expected. "All right," he said. "I'll send word." The meeting with Rosalie Calloway and her Helena contact happened on the 28th of December, which gave Marlowe 12 days to prepare, and she used all 12 of them. She was not, by nature, a person who over-prepared for conversations. her subject well enough to answer any question honestly, and to trust that honesty was a better strategy than rehearsal. But this was different from a conversation. This was a business assessment, and she had learned enough about business assessments to know that the preparation that mattered most was not the speech you practiced, but the documentation you could produce. She organized the ledgers, both of them all the way back to September. Temperature logs, batch records, production schedules, maintenance cycles, quality assessments, yield calculations. She had been keeping this record for herself and for the operation's integrity, but she understood now that it was also a kind of argument, a written, dated, specific argument that could not be undone by rumor or reputation. She pulled the best examples of finished product and set them aside in the coldest section of the smokehouse, where they would hold their quality through the 12 days. She prepared a written summary of the operation's current capacity and projected capacity, with the specific bottlenecks identified and the expansion solutions she had been developing in her head since November. She had been developing them because the ideas had been there, building themselves, and she was not the kind of person who could stop an idea from developing just because she hadn't decided yet whether to use it. Tomas found her working on the capacity summary late one evening and asked what she was doing. She explained. He listened, and then he asked two questions that were sharp enough that she stopped and wrote down his phrasing, because sometimes someone asking a question from outside your own thinking gave it a better shape than you could from inside. "You're going to need more than one chamber if you're talking about Helena volume," he said. "I know. Is that something Mr. Blackstone would build?" She looked at Tomas. He was 18 years old, or close to it, and he was asking the right question. "That's part of what needs to be worked out," she said. "You should know the answer before you walk into that meeting," he said, not aggressively but practically, the way he asked most things. "I intend to," she said. She went to Garrett that same evening. She had the capacity summary with her, and she laid it on the table between them, and she walked him through it methodically, the same way she'd walked the Henderson brothers through the smokehouse. Not a performance, just an explanation. "Current capacity handles the Valley contracts and a moderate cushion," she said. "A Helena distributor at any real volume would require a second chamber, possibly a third, depending on the contract terms." She tapped the page where she'd drawn the rough expansion diagram. "The existing structure can accommodate an addition on the east side. I've looked at the footprint. It's workable." Garrett looked at the diagram. He looked at it for a while without speaking. "This is not a small investment," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." "And you think the Helena contract would justify it?" "I think the Helena contract plus the Valley contracts, plus the inquiry from Patrice Dumont, plus whatever comes after them, would justify it." She paused. "I'm not saying do it immediately. I'm saying go into the meeting knowing whether it's possible, so you're not caught off guard if the conversation goes there." He looked up from the diagram. "Is it possible?" "The structure is possible," she said. "Whether the financing is possible is your question to answer, not mine." He was quiet for a moment. In that internal way of his, the way she had come to understand meant he was working through something that had multiple layers. "If the Helena contract comes through," he said slowly, "and if the spring contracts fulfill as projected, I could service a building loan." He paused. "It would be tight." "Most things worth doing are tight," she said. He almost smiled. "You sound like someone who's done this before." "I've never done this specific thing before," she said honestly. "But I've been in enough operations to know what scaling looks like when it's being built on a real foundation versus when it's being built on hope." She looked at him directly. "This is a real foundation, Garrett. What's on those shelves is real. What the Hendersons and the Callaways signed is real. I'm not asking you to bet on potential. I'm asking you to bet on something that already exists." He was quiet for long enough that the fire in the main house stove made three distinct sounds, a settling, a pop, and a sustained low burn, before he spoke. "Tell me what you need for the meeting," he said. Rosalie Callaway arrived on the 28th with a woman named Frances Holt, who ran a supply company out of Helena that distributed to 11 hotels and 37 restaurants across the territory. Frances Holt was in her mid-40s, wore her coat like it was business clothes, and made no small talk. The moment she was inside the smokehouse, she was reading the space the way an engineer reads a structure, calculating load, flow, capacity, access. Marlowe liked her immediately. She took them through everything, the same as before. The fire chamber, the hanging system, the brine work, the temperature management. Francis Holt asked questions that nobody else had asked, questions about yield ratios and moisture loss calculations and shelf stability under variable temperature transport, and Marlowe answered every one from memory and then showed her the corresponding ledger entry. At one point, Francis Holt picked up the second ledger and read it for several minutes without looking up, and the room was quiet, and Rosalie Calloway gave Marlowe a look that was somewhere between encouragement and amusement. "These records are better than what I see from operations 3 times this size," Francis Holt said, setting the ledger down. "They're not complete yet," Marlowe said. "I've only been here 4 months. I'm still learning the specific conditions of this property." Francis Holt looked at her. "You're aware that's not a normal thing to say when you're trying to sell someone on your operation." "I'm not trying to sell you on a version of this that doesn't exist yet," Marlowe said. "What I'm selling you on is the version that already exists, which I can document to the inch, and the version that will exist when the operation has a year of full data behind it, which I can project accurately because I know what I'm doing." She paused. "If you need someone to tell you everything is perfect and there's no learning curve and you're getting a finished product from day one, I'm the wrong person. If you need someone who will tell you exactly what she has and exactly what she doesn't and build toward the rest without pretending otherwise, then we should probably keep talking." Francis Holt looked at her for a long moment. "What's your current chamber capacity?" she asked. "At full operation, the current structure can handle approximately 60% of what I estimate your minimum volume requirement would be. And the other 40%? Requires expansion, which is possible on this property." Marlowe nodded toward Garrett, who was standing near the door. "Mr. Blackstone and I have discussed the structural and financial framework." Francis Holt looked at Garrett. Garrett held her gaze and nodded, once. "Timeline?" Francis Holt said, back to Marlowe. "If the decision is made before the end of January and construction begins at first thaw, the expanded capacity would be operational by the start of June." "That's a tight window." "Everything out here is a tight window," Marlowe said. "The question is whether the thing at the end of it is worth the tightness." Francis Holt was quiet. She looked around the smokehouse one more time, at the shelves, at the hanging batches, at the fire chamber, at the 2 ledgers sitting side by side on the workbench. She was doing her own accounting, Marlowe knew, and she let her do it without interruption. "I'll need samples," Francis Holt said, "to take back to Helena, labeled with the date, the batch record number, and the cut specifications." "I'll have them ready before you leave," Marlowe said, "and I'll need a written capacity proposal, not a sales document, an operational plan, timelines, volume projections, contingencies." "I can have it to you by the 15th of January. Francis Holt nodded. She looked at Rosalie Calloway. Some communication passed between them that Marlowe couldn't fully read. Then Francis Holt looked back at Marlowe. "I don't make decisions until I've looked at the samples and had my own people review the proposal," she said. "But I'm not here because I had nothing better to do with my time." It was not a commitment, but it was a great deal more than nothing. After they left, Garrett stood in the smokehouse doorway the same way he had stood there in October, and in November, and in early December. Not quite inside, not quite outside. Marlowe was already making notes for the capacity proposal. "How do you think that went?" he asked. "Better than it could have," she said. "Not as well as I would have liked." "That's a careful answer." "It's an honest one." She looked up from the notepad. "She's serious. She's also cautious, which is reasonable. She's running a distribution business, and she can't afford to lock into a supply contract that doesn't deliver. She'll look at those samples and she'll think about it hard before she comes back. And when she comes back..." Marlowe put the notepad down and looked at him. The smokehouse was warm around them, the fire chamber doing what it did, the smoke moving in the upper air, the smell of cured meat and salt and hickory wood filling the space so completely that she had stopped noticing it, except in moments like this one, when she noticed everything. "When she comes back," Marlowe said, "I'll be ready." She went back to her notes. Garrett stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. "Marlowe," he said, "Rosalie Calloway told me something when you were packing the sample boxes." She looked up. She said, and I'm quoting her directly, she said, "That woman is the best thing that's happened to this ranch in 10 years. Don't be stupid about it." He paused. "I thought you should know someone said that." Marlowe held his gaze for a moment. "I thought you should know," he said again, quieter, and then he left before she could figure out what to do with it. She sat with it for a moment, that sentence. the way it sat in her chest like something warm and unexpected. Then she picked up the notepad. She had a capacity proposal to write, and January was not going to wait. The capacity proposal took her 9 days to write, not because the information was difficult. She had all of it in her head and in the ledgers, the numbers and timelines and contingency structures that Frances Holt had asked for. The writing itself went quickly. What took 9 days was the decision about what kind of document it was going to be. She had written proposals before, in other places, for other operations. Most of them had been written to impress, arranged to lead with strengths and bury complications, designed to create confidence rather than accuracy. She had written them that way because that was how you wrote proposals if you wanted them accepted, and she had needed them accepted. She sat with this one differently. On the third day, she threw out the first draft and started again, because the first draft was doing the thing she had told Frances Holt she wouldn't do, presenting a version of the operation that was slightly more polished than the truth. Not dishonest, just optimistic in the particular way of documents that wanted something. The second draft was harder to write and better when it was finished. It said exactly what she had, exactly what she didn't, exactly what the gap between the two would require in terms of capital and time and specific risk. The contingency section was longer than the projection section, which was not typical for a proposal designed to attract a contract, but which she felt was the right choice for this particular reader. She showed it to Garrett on the 10th of January, 4 days before the deadline. He read it twice, which she had expected, and then he set it down and looked at her. "You included the storm losses," he said. "Yes." "You included the lamb batch?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Most people would have left that out. Frances Holt is going to find out about the lamb batch eventually, because it's in the ledger, and the ledger is part of the documentation package. If she finds out I omitted it from the proposal, that's worse than the batch itself. She paused. Besides, the loss is not the story. The recovery is the story. One batch, 36-hour storm, everything else intact. That's the argument I want her making in her own head. Garrett looked at the proposal again. "The expansion section is specific," he said. "I wanted her to understand we've already done the thinking. This isn't aspirational. It's a plan with a specific footprint, a construction timeline, and a budget range." She pointed to the third page. "The range is conservative on the high end. I'd rather she sees a number and it comes in under than the reverse." He turned to the third page. "Read it." "This is a real number, Marlowe. This isn't a theoretical investment." "No," she said, "it's not. I'd need the spring contracts to fully fulfill and the Helena contract to be significant to service this." "I know," she said. "I calculated the fulfillment threshold." She turned to the last page and pointed to the bottom. "That line. That's the number the Helena contract needs to hit for the expansion to be self-financing within 2 years." He looked at the number. "That's a lot," he said. "It's a lot," she agreed. "Frances Holt moves that volume. I looked into her distribution company before I wrote the proposal. She supplies 11 hotels, and at least 4 of them are the kind of establishments where the kitchen budget alone would cover this number 3 times over." He looked up from the page. "You researched her company." "I wrote a proposal for a business relationship," Marlowe said. "Understanding who you're proposing to is the minimum reasonable standard." He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. It was the expression she had come to associate with the moments when she said something that was so straightforward he hadn't thought of it himself and then felt slightly embarrassed about that. "Send it," he said, "as written." She sent it the next morning, and then she went back to the smokehouse because the proposal was finished and there was nothing else she could do about it, and the smokehouse did not pause for decisions that were out of her hands. January moved slowly, which was its nature. The cold had settled into the particular sustained register that came after the dramatic storms of November and December. Not dramatic, just permanent. A cold that became the baseline condition against which everything else was measured. The snow on the ground was hard-packed and old, no longer picturesque, just a fact of the landscape. She ran the smokehouse on a tight, precise schedule, the way you ran an operation when you had committed to specific delivery volumes and the margin for error had narrowed. The Valley contracts, Henderson, Callaway, and now Patrice Dumont, who had formalized her arrangement in December, required a consistent output that she had not produced before because she had not had to. Consistency at scale was different from excellence in individual batches. It required a different discipline, Not the peak performance of the best days, but the sustained competence of every day, including the days when she was tired and cold, and the fire was being difficult, and the brine on batch 7 was running 2 degrees off what she wanted. She ran it. She did not always run it perfectly. She made 3 adjustments in January that she logged as corrections. Not failures, corrections, which was a distinction she maintained carefully, and each one made the next cycle better. Tomas was with her through most of it. He had stopped being a student in the formal sense and had become something more like a second operator, someone she could leave at the fire chamber for an hour and trust that when she came back, the decisions made in that hour would be sound ones. She had not told him this explicitly. She had told him by leaving him there and not hovering when she returned. He noticed. She could tell because his posture in the smokehouse changed, slightly, incrementally, over a period of weeks, from the posture of someone who was learning in someone else's space to the posture of someone who belonged in a space and knew it. She thought sometimes about what happened to Tomas when she left, because she had not stopped thinking of this as temporary, even though the word partner had been said in her presence twice now, and she was in the middle of writing a capacity proposal that assumed her continued presence. Old habits of mind were the last things to change. She did not say this to Tomas. It wasn't fair to burden him with her own unresolved questions, but she thought about it, and it was part of what she meant when she told him, in the second week of January, that she was going to write down everything she knew about the smokehouse operation in a document separate from the ledgers. "Why?" he asked. "Because the ledgers are a record," she said. "What I'm talking about is a guide. The difference is the ledgers tell you what happened. The guide tells you what to do." He was quiet, processing this. "You're writing it for me," he said. Not a question. "I'm writing it for whoever runs this smokehouse after I do," she said carefully. "That might be you. It might be someone else. But the knowledge shouldn't live only in one person's head." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, somewhere between gratitude and something that might have been the specific sadness of a young person registering that things end. "Will you be here for the Helena contract?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Let's see what Francis Holt says." Francis Holt's response arrived on the 21st of January. It came in the form of a letter delivered by the supply wagon, and Marlowe happened to be the one who signed for the delivery because she had been waiting for a salt shipment that was on the same wagon. She saw the Helena postmark, and she set it on the workbench and finished checking the salt delivery before she opened it, because she had decided some time ago that the best way to receive important news was to make sure the necessary work was done first. If the news was bad, you needed your footing. If it was good, it could wait 3 more minutes. The salt was correct. All 12 bags, the right grade. She opened the letter. It was 3 pages, which told her something before she read a word of it. A rejection was 1 paragraph. 3 pages was a conversation. Francis Holt had read the proposal with what appeared to be genuine engagement. She had specific responses to specific sections. The storm loss documentation, which she described as unusual for a proposal of this type and significantly more reassuring than a clean version would have been. The expansion timeline, which she pushed back on by 2 weeks on the construction start, citing thaw conditions in that part of the territory that Marlowe had underestimated. The contingency structures, which she found adequate on 4 of the 6 scenarios and wanted to discuss further on the remaining 2. At the bottom of the second page, she wrote, "I am prepared to offer a provisional contract pending a final site visit and resolution of the 2 outstanding contingency questions. The volume I am prepared to commit to in year 1 is below what your proposal projected as the break-even threshold, but I'm including an option clause for year 2 that, if exercised, would exceed that threshold by approximately 15%. Marlowe read that paragraph 3 times. Below break-even in year 1. Option for year 2 above break-even by 15%. She did the math in her head, quickly and then more carefully. If the option was exercised, and Francis Holt had not struck her as someone who included options she didn't intend to use, the 2-year aggregate would clear the expansion financing threshold. It would be tighter than the scenario she'd written in the proposal, but it would work. It would require Garrett to make the expansion decision before the year 2 numbers were guaranteed. That was the risk. She carried the letter to the main house. Garrett read it the way he read everything important, slowly, without rushing himself, going back to sections he'd already read. She sat across the table and drank coffee and didn't try to interpret his expression, which was doing several things at once. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was his version of doing the math. The year one number doesn't cover the construction loan, he said. No. So the year one operating period would require me to service the loan from the Valley contracts. From the Valley contracts and whatever cash reserve you have at the end of winter, she said. Which depends on how the spring fulfillment goes, she paused. I've run the numbers, Garrett. It's manageable if everything fulfills as contracted. If one of the Valley contracts falls short, it's uncomfortable but survivable. If two fall short, it gets hard, he said. Yes. He was quiet. She let the quiet exist. The option clause, he said. She phrases it as something she's prepared to exercise, not something she intends to exercise. I noticed that too, Marlowe said. I think it's her version of honest. She can't commit to year two until she sees year one, which is reasonable. But I also think she included it because she expects to use it. Otherwise, she'd have proposed a flat year one contract. He looked at her. You trust her? I think she's a serious person, Marlowe said carefully. I think she does what she says she'll do. Whether that constitutes trust is a word question as much as anything else. He turned the letter over and looked at the back, which was blank, as if the answer might be there. If I say yes to this, he said, and the expansion goes forward, and year one comes in below threshold, I'm going to need the Valley contracts to perform exactly as projected. Yes. Which means the smokehouse needs to run at the level it's been running without any significant interruptions. That's already what it needs to do regardless of the Helena decision, she said. The Valley contracts have those requirements built in. He looked at her. I know. I'm saying it out loud to hear how it sounds. She understood. Sometimes you said things out loud not because the other person didn't know them, but because saying them out loud was how you made a decision real to yourself. Write back to Frances Holt, she said. Tell her you want to schedule the final site visit. Work out the 2 contingency questions in person. She paused. And when she's here, let me do the talking about the operation. I always let you do the talking about the operation, he said. I know, she said. I'm just making sure we're both clear that this time it matters more. He almost smiled. Then he picked up the letter and stood. I'll write to her today, he said. What happened in the last week of January was not something Marlowe had planned, and it changed the shape of several things she had been holding carefully in a specific arrangement. It began with Pete. She found him in the smokehouse on a Tuesday afternoon, standing near the hanging batches with an expression that was not his usual guarded one. He didn't seem to be doing anything, which was itself unusual. Pete was always doing something, or appearing to do something, which was his version of the same habit. You need something? She asked. He turned. No, he said, and then he said, I want to ask you something. She waited. The way you know when a batch is going off, he said, is that something you can teach? She looked at him steadily. Why are you asking? He looked slightly uncomfortable, which was also unusual. I've been watching Tomas learn it, and I've been thinking. He stopped. I've been on this ranch 4 years. I know the cattle work. I know the perimeter, the fencing, the feeding schedules. But this, he gestured vaguely at the smokehouse around him. This is going to be what keeps the ranch going, and I don't know any of it. It was the most honest thing Pete had ever said in her presence. She took a moment to acknowledge that to herself privately, and then she said, Yes, I can teach you. He nodded, once, in the abrupt way of a man who is relieved but not going to show it. When? Start tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. You'll shadow Tomas first. He's further along and you'll learn faster from watching him make decisions than from watching me explain things. Pete's expression shifted slightly at the idea of learning from Tomas, who was several years younger and had less seniority on the ranch. But he absorbed it without argument, which told her something had changed in how he was calculating things. 6 o'clock, he said, and left. She stood in the smokehouse after he was gone and thought about what had just happened. Pete coming to her, not to challenge, not to report back to Silas, but to genuinely ask to learn. It was a small thing, and it was also not a small thing at all. She wrote it in the guide she was building for the smokehouse. Not as an anecdote, but as a principle. People will come to the work when the work is undeniable. Don't go looking for converts. Let the results do that. Silas came to her on a Thursday, 2 days later. He came in the early morning before the rest of the ranch was moving, which told her he had timed it deliberately. He knocked on the smokehouse door, which he had not done before. He had always just appeared. And she said, "Come in." And he did. He stood near the door, not moving further into the space, and he had the look of a man who had decided to say something and was in the final stages of deciding exactly how. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I'd prefer you let me finish before you respond." "All right," she said. "When you came here, I made up my mind about you before I had any grounds for it." He said it flatly, without decoration. "I made up my mind based on what I saw when I looked at you, which was a woman I'd already decided couldn't do this work. And then I did a thing I'm not proud of, and you rebuilt what I destroyed, and you didn't ask for an apology, and you didn't try to get me back, and I've been watching what you've built here for 4 months." He stopped. She waited. "I was wrong," he said. "About all of it. I was wrong in the way a man is wrong when he's afraid of being wrong, which is the worst kind. And I don't expect that to fix anything. I just—" He paused again. "I thought you should hear it said plainly." The smokehouse was very quiet. The fire made its low sound. The smoke moved in the upper air. "I hear it," she said. He nodded. "Silas," she said. He stopped. "The maintenance cycle in February is going to need 3 days minimum. I'm going to need the south wall reinforced before I do it, which is a 2-person job. I'd like your help with it." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she couldn't name precisely. Relief, maybe, or the particular release of a tension that had been held for a long time. "Tell me when," he said. "I'll put it in the schedule," she said. "You'll see it." He left, and she turned back to the fire chamber, and she let herself feel what that conversation had cost both of them, the particular weight of it. And then she set it down and got back to work, because the work didn't pause for anything, and that was one of the things she had always loved about it. Francis Holt's final site visit was scheduled for the 14th of February, which arrived at the end of the coldest sustained week of the winter, the kind of cold that went past discomfort into something more fundamental, a cold that made the air brittle, and sounds carry strange distances, and the smoke from every chimney on the property rise in perfectly vertical columns because the air was too cold to be moved by anything. She arrived with the same brisk, unornamented manner as before, shook hands with Garrett at the main house, asked a single small-talk question about the road conditions coming up from Havre, and then said she wanted to go directly to the smokehouse. The 2 contingency questions from the letter were resolved in the first 40 minutes of conversation. Marlowe had prepared specific answers to both, with documentation to support them, and Francis Holt asked 2 follow-up questions on the first one and none on the second, which meant she had already been leaning toward accepting the answer on the second, and had brought it to the meeting as due diligence rather than genuine concern. After the contingency discussion, Francis Holt walked the smokehouse again, slowly, looking at things she had looked at in December with fresh eyes. She picked up the second ledger and turned to the January entries and read them. She looked at the batch records for the Valley contract deliveries. She looked at the hanging inventory and appeared to be calculating something in her head. Then she said, "I want to meet the other one." Marlowe looked at her. "Tomas?" "The one who's been running the night cycles since December," Francis Holt said. "The log entries are in a different hand, smaller, more systematic about temperature intervals than your entries, actually." Marlowe filed that observation away for later. "I'll get him." She found Tomas in the barn and told him Francis Holt wanted to speak with him, and she watched something move across his face. Not quite fear, but the precursor to it, the moment before a person decides whether they're going to rise to something or retreat from it. He rose to it. She had expected he would. He answered Francis Holt's questions directly, with no performance and no false confidence. He said, "I don't know," twice, which was the right answer both times. He said, "Ms. Bennett taught me that 4 times, which was attribution without deflection. He wasn't hiding behind her, just being accurate about where his knowledge came from. And at one point he walked over to the fire chamber without being asked and made a minor adjustment, and then returned to the conversation as if nothing had happened, and Marlowe could see Francis Holt register this in the particular way serious people registered competence when they saw it unexpectedly. After Tomas left, Francis Holt stood in the middle of the smokehouse and looked at Marlowe. "You're training a successor," she said. "I'm training a second operator," Marlowe said carefully. "For a single-chamber operation with one primary operator. Training a second operator at this level of investment is either redundancy or succession planning. Francis Holt's eyes were direct. I don't think you're the kind of person who does redundancy for its own sake. Marlowe held her gaze. I think operations that depend entirely on one person are fragile, she said, regardless of who that person is. Francis Holt considered this. Are you planning to stay? It was the most direct version of the question anyone had asked her, and it landed in the particular way of direct questions asked at the exact moment you haven't finished answering them for yourself. I'm planning to see this operation through to what it can become, Marlowe said. What that looks like structurally is still being determined. Francis Holt was quiet for a moment. I'll tell you something, she said. I've been in this business for 22 years, and I have walked into a lot of operations. Most of them, the person running the floor is either exceptional or the records are exceptional, almost never both. She looked around the smokehouse one more time. The reason I'm here is both. She looked back at Marlowe. I'm prepared to formalize the contract on the terms I proposed, with one modification, she said. I'd like the option clause converted to a conditional commitment. Not an option, but a commitment. Contingent on year one fulfillment meeting, 80% of the contracted volume. Marlowe calculated this immediately. 80% fulfillment triggering year two commitment. That threshold was achievable, more than achievable. I'd need to confirm that with Garrett before I can answer, she said. Of course, Francis Holt said. I'll need his answer before I leave. Marlowe went to the main house and found Garrett in the kitchen, where he had evidently been finding reasons to stay within earshot. She told him the modification. He asked one question. What does 80% fulfillment look like in actual volume? She told him. We can hit that, he said. I know, she said. That's why I came to tell you instead of saying no. He almost smiled again. Tell her yes. She went back to the smokehouse. She told Francis Holt yes. Francis Holt nodded once, took a document from her coat, and laid it on the workbench. I had my attorney draft the conditional language before I came, she said. I was reasonably confident we'd reach this point. Marlowe looked at the document. She looked at Francis Holt. You were confident? I read your proposal carefully, Francis Holt said. A person who documents their failures as thoroughly as their successes is either someone who learns from everything or someone who is building a legal record for a dispute. You didn't strike me as litigious. Marlowe looked down at the document. I'd like Garrett to read this before we sign anything. Naturally, Francis Holt said. Garrett read it at the kitchen table with Francis Holt sitting across from him and Marlowe standing near the window, and he asked 3 questions about the conditional language and got 3 satisfactory answers, and then he signed it, and Francis Holt signed it, and it was done in the way that important things were done when both parties had already done their real deciding before they sat down, quickly, without drama, with only the small sound of a pen on paper and the quiet of the winter afternoon outside. After Francis Holt left, Garrett stood in the kitchen and looked at the copy of the contract in his hand. We need to start planning the expansion, he said. I know, Marlowe said. I'll need your input on the construction specifications. I know that too, she said. He looked at her. Not at the contract, not at the window, at her. It was the look she had seen developing over 4 months, the one that had started as assessment and had moved through something she couldn't name and had arrived somewhere that felt like, she didn't have a clean word for it. Seeing. The specific quality of being seen by someone who had been paying genuine attention. Rosalie Calloway was right, he said. She looked at him steadily. I should have proposed a partnership arrangement 3 months ago, he said. I'd been thinking about it since November, since you showed me the capacity diagram. And then I kept finding reasons to wait, and the real reason I was waiting was that I was afraid you'd say no and leave. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows. I might have said no in November, she said honestly. I don't know. And now? He said. She thought about the guide she was writing for the smokehouse, the knowledge she was putting into a document so it would outlast her. She thought about Tomas and what she was building in him. She thought about the expansion plan she had been developing in her mind since December, the 2nd and 3rd chamber, the additional hanging capacity, the modified brine system that would make the scaling cleaner. She thought about the smell of hickory smoke that she had stopped noticing except in moments when she noticed everything. Now I'd like to see the partnership agreement before I answer, she said. In writing, specific terms. Not because I don't trust you, because specific terms are how you build something that doesn't depend on whether two people still agree with each other in 5 years. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. I'll have it drafted, he said. Good, she said. She picked up her coat and went back to the smokehouse, because the afternoon cycle needed checking and because she had learned over a long time in this work that the best response to something significant happening was to return to the work that had made it possible. The fire was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The smoke was moving right. The temperature was holding where she needed it. She stood in the middle of the smokehouse and she let herself feel, for just a moment, the particular quality of a thing settling into place. Not perfect, not finished, but aligned in a way that felt like the beginning of something that could last. Then she picked up the ledger and made the day's entry, and the work continued. The partnership agreement took 3 weeks to draft. Garrett had retained a lawyer in Havre, a careful, deliberate man named Aldous Fenn, who wrote contracts the way certain people built fences, with more attention to the corners than the straightaways, because the corners were where things eventually failed. Fenn sent a first draft on the 28th of February, and Marlowe read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before she finished, because she read it the way she read everything that mattered. Slowly, going back, reading between the stated terms for the unstated assumptions. She had 3 pages of notes when she was done. Not objections, exactly. Questions. Places where the language was general when she needed it specific, or specific when the generality would serve them better. Places where the agreement described what would happen when things went right without accounting adequately for what would happen when they didn't, which was always the part that mattered most. She brought her notes to Garrett the next morning, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table and went through them one by one. And this was, she thought later, the conversation that told her more about him than any of the dramatic moments of the previous 5 months. Because anyone could be decent in a crisis. A crisis gave you a role and a clear task, and an obvious way to be good. The slow procedural work of building an agreement, line by line, term by term, neither of them getting everything they wanted, both of them having to say out loud what they valued and why. That was harder and more revealing. He pushed back on 2 of her points. She pushed back on one of his. They found language on the 3rd try that neither of them loved entirely, but both of them could live with, which Fenn had told them was the correct standard for a partnership agreement, and which Marlowe had already known from a different kind of experience. The equity split was 40% to her, 60% to him, which she had proposed herself. He had initially said 50-50, and she had said no. Why? He asked, and he was genuinely asking, not negotiating. Because the land is yours, she said. The cattle operation is yours. The infrastructure is yours. What I brought was the knowledge and the work, and the knowledge and the work are worth 40% of what this becomes, not half of what it already was. He looked at her for a long moment. What if I disagree? You can disagree, she said, but I won't take 50% of something I didn't build from the beginning. It would feel wrong every time I looked at the number. He was quiet. That's an unusual reason. I'm an unusual person, she said. You knew that before you hired me. They went with 40%. The agreement was finalized and signed on the 19th of March, on a morning when the first real suggestion of thaw had appeared in the air. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of something, the cold pulling back an inch from its previous position. Aldous Fenn rode out from Havre to witness the signing, drank a cup of coffee with them, and rode back without ceremony, which was exactly the right approach. Garrett set the signed documents on the table between them and looked at them for a moment. I want to say something, he said. All right, she said. When I wrote that letter to you in August, I was closer to the edge than I let on. The smokehouse wasn't just a problem I needed solved. It was the last thing I could think of that might change the direction this ranch was heading. He paused. I didn't tell you that because I didn't want it to change what you asked for. She looked at him steadily. It wouldn't have. I know that now, he said. I didn't know it then. She picked up her copy of the agreement and folded it once along its length, the way she folded documents she was going to keep. The ranch isn't heading in that direction anymore, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She stood up. The expansion contractor is coming Thursday to look at the east wall footprint. I need to be there for that. I'll be there too, he said. She nodded and went back to work. and behind her she heard the small, quiet sound of him picking up his own copy of the agreement, and the morning continued. The way mornings continued when something important had been done and the world didn't pause to mark it, but moved on to the next thing, which was always the next thing. The expansion began in the first week of April, when the ground had thawed enough for the foundation work. It was loud and inconvenient, and threw the smokehouse schedule into the kind of controlled chaos that Marlowe had anticipated and planned for, and still found exhausting in practice. The construction crew, 4 men from Have who worked without drama and asked sensible questions, needed access to the east wall that required her to reorganize the hanging system and shift 2 batches into a timing sequence she hadn't originally intended. She managed it. Not gracefully, because there was no graceful version of running a precision operation while half your wall was being extended, but competently, which was what she had and what the situation required. Tomas was indispensable during the construction weeks. He ran the morning cycles without supervision while she dealt with the contractors, made decisions she would have made the same way, and flagged the one situation she would have handled differently: a temperature fluctuation caused by the construction disturbance on the east wall, before it became a problem. She arrived at the smokehouse to find the issue already corrected and logged, with Tomas's note in the margin explaining his reasoning. His reasoning was sound. She said so and meant it, and watched him absorb the acknowledgement without letting it go to his head, which was its own kind of evidence of who he was becoming. Pete worked alongside the construction crew when his cattle duties allowed it, carrying materials and digging where the crew needed digging, and she noticed Silas had assigned him there rather than to other tasks, which was Silas's way of contributing without making a direct offer. She noticed it and said nothing and appreciated it for exactly what it was. The second chamber was operational by the 15th of May, 30 days before the Helena contract required it. She spent 2 weeks running calibration cycles, fire behavior, smoke distribution, temperature consistency across the new space, and she documented every variance and every correction with the same detail she had brought to the original chamber's early operation. The second chamber was not identical to the first. No 2 chambers were, in her experience. Each one had its own character, its own particular tendencies, and the knowledge of how to work with those tendencies was earned rather than transferred. She earned it. By the time the first Helena delivery was due in mid-June, both chambers were running in a synchronized schedule that she had developed over 3 weeks of deliberate planning, accounting for the fact that the 2 spaces had different peak performance windows and that the combined output needed to be both higher and more consistent than anything she had managed before. The first Helena delivery went out on a Tuesday. 12 crates, labeled and documented to the standard Francis Holt had specified, loaded onto a wagon that Garrett drove himself to the Havre railhead where the distributor's transport collected it. He came back that evening and said, "The receiving agent counted every crate and read every label and didn't say a word the entire time." "Is that good?" Tomas asked. He had been in the smokehouse when Garrett arrived and was now standing near the door. "In my experience," Marlowe said, "people who have complaints make them immediately. People who don't have complaints get quiet." "Then it's good," Garrett said. She went back to what she was doing, but she let herself feel it, the specific satisfaction of a thing completed at the standard she had set for it. Not relief. She had not been afraid it would fail, just satisfaction, clean and earned and hers. Francis Holt's first formal evaluation came in late July, 3 deliveries into the contract. It arrived as a letter, 2 pages, detailed and without flattery. She noted the consistency of the product across all 3 deliveries, which she described as exceeding her projections. She noted one packaging issue on the second delivery, a labeling inconsistency that had caused minor confusion at one of the hotel kitchens, and specified the correction she required. Marlowe had already identified and corrected the labeling issue before the letter arrived, because she had caught it herself on the 3rd delivery and logged it. She wrote back to say so and included the corrected procedure documentation. Francis Holt wrote back 4 days later with 2 words, "Noted, continue." It was, Marlowe understood, the closest thing to a compliment she was likely to get from Francis Holt, and she found she respected it more than she would have respected effusive praise. The Year 1 fulfillment reached 83% of the contracted volume by October, 3 months before the year-end deadline. When Marlowe ran the final calculation and showed Garrett the number, he looked at it for a moment and then looked at her. The conditional commitment triggers, he said. Yes, she said. Automatically, under the contract terms. I'll send Frances Holt the fulfillment documentation. She'll already know, he said. She tracks her suppliers. I know, Marlowe said. But we document it anyway. That's how you build a record. He smiled at that. Not almost smiled, actually smiled, which was still infrequent enough to be noticeable. You're going to be documenting things until you're 90, he said. Probably, she said. The documentation is what lasts. Colton Briggs made one more attempt. She had wondered when it would come, because men like Briggs did not stop. They redirected, and she had been watching for the redirection since February. It came in September, in the form of a letter to Garrett that was very carefully written. She read it when Garrett showed it to her, and she could see Fenn-level legal precision in it, even though Briggs had clearly not used Fenn, offering to purchase a partial stake in the expanded smokehouse operation, not the ranch, just the smokehouse. It was smarter than the full purchase offer had been, and she gave Briggs credit for that. He had assessed the situation and identified the specific asset that had changed the ranch's trajectory and made a targeted approach to acquire a piece of it. She read the letter twice and handed it back to Garrett. No, she said. I know, he said. I'm not considering it. I just wanted you to see it. Why? He looked at her. Because it's addressed to me, but it's about you. He's not trying to buy into the smokehouse operation. He's trying to buy a seat at a table where you're sitting. He knows what's driving this now. He folded the letter. I thought you should know that he knows. She absorbed this. Write back and decline. Keep it brief and don't explain. That was my plan, he said. Good, she said. She thought about Briggs on the walk back to the smokehouse, and what she thought was this. There was a version of the world in which a man like Briggs won, not because he was right, but because he had resources and patience and no particular scruples about the methods he used. She had seen that version of the world operate before. She had lost things to it before. What had changed was not Briggs. Men like Briggs didn't change. What had changed was the ground beneath her feet, which was now documented and signed and legally specific, and the 2 ledgers on the workbench that went back to September of the previous year, and the Valley contracts and the Helena contract and the second chamber and Tomas and the guide she had written, and Silas reinforcing the south wall in February without being asked twice. You couldn't argue with that accumulation. You could try, but the weight of it was too distributed, too real, located in too many specific places to be dislodged by one person's campaign. She went back to work. On a Thursday in October, nearly 13 months after she had stepped off a wagon into a mud-floored smokehouse with rusted venting and a warped door, Marlowe sat down with the guide she had been writing since January and read it from the beginning. It was 61 pages. She had not planned 61 pages. The number had accumulated the same way the ledgers had accumulated, one day at a time, one entry at a time, one careful observation added to the one before it, until the whole was something larger than she had been building toward. She read it slowly. She made corrections in 11 places, additions in 4, and removed one section that she had decided was more personal than practical and belonged in the ledger rather than the guide. When she was finished, she set it on the workbench and looked at it. Tomas came in for the afternoon cycle and saw it. He had known she was writing it. She had told him in January, but she had not shown it to him before now. Is it finished? He asked. Finished enough, she said. There will always be more to add. That's the nature of it. He looked at the stack of pages with an expression she had learned to read over the past year, the particular attention he gave to things that mattered to him without his meaning to show it. Can I read it? He asked. It's yours, she said. When the time comes. He looked at her. When is the time? She thought about how to answer this honestly. When you're running this place and I'm not standing here to ask, she said. Or before that, if you want to learn faster, then I can teach you in person. Can I read it now? She looked at him for a moment. I was 19 now, or close to it, and the smokehouse had done something to him that she had watched happen and still couldn't fully describe. It had given him the particular confidence of a person who knows a real thing, a deep thing, a thing that took time to learn and cannot be faked. He stood in the space the way she stood in it. Not her way exactly, his own way, which had grown from her teaching but had become something she hadn't specifically taught, which was the sign she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. "Yes," she said. "Read it now." She left him with it and went to check the south chamber, and when she came back an hour later he was still reading, and she did not interrupt him, and the fire did what fire did, and the smoke moved the way it moved, and the afternoon wore through to evening around them both. The winter of the second year was not easy. Winters in the Montana highlands were not easy and were not designed to be, and anyone who told you different was selling something. But it was different from the first winter in the way that things were different when you had a structure around you instead of building it while the cold came in. The second chamber meant the load was distributed. Tomas's competence meant the load was distributed further. The Helena contract meant the stakes were clear and the target was specific, and everyone on the ranch understood what they were working toward and why. There were problems. A batch in November that she had to redirect because of a brine chemistry issue she hadn't encountered before, which turned out to be related to a change in the salt supplier's product that she only identified after 2 days of methodical investigation. A week in December when Tomas was ill and she ran both chambers herself on reduced sleep, which was not as bad as the first year's blizzard, but accumulated in her body in a way that reminded her she was 39 and not immune to arithmetic. A disagreement with Garrett in January about the third chamber, which she wanted to add and he wanted to wait on for financial reasons, and they argued about it. A real argument, not a careful professional discussion, with raised voices and a door closed harder than necessary, and resolved it 2 days later with a compromise that was probably right and was definitely imperfect, which was the correct outcome for a real argument between two people who were both partly right. She had not had arguments about money and timing and construction before, with anyone, because she had not had anything to build before. She had had jobs. Jobs ended. What she was in now was something that didn't end, which meant the arguments were also something that didn't end. They just resolved, and then came back in new forms, and you handled them as they came. She was still learning how to do that. She suspected she would be learning it for a long time. The day that meant the most to her that second winter was not a dramatic one. It was a Wednesday in February, ordinary in every external way. She was in the north chamber running an afternoon cycle, and Silas came in, not to ask anything, not to report or request, just because he had started doing this occasionally, stopping in the way that people stopped in places where they had come to feel they had standing. He looked at the hanging inventory for a moment, hands in his coat pockets. "You're running the new batch earlier than the schedule said," he observed. "The temperature differential between the chambers has been running higher than I expected this week," she said. "I moved it up 2 days to account for the variance." He nodded slowly, taking this in. "You changed the schedule and didn't put it in the common log." She looked at him. He was right. She had made the decision quickly and hadn't stopped to document it in the shared system she and Tomas used to coordinate. "You're right," she said. "I'll add it." He nodded again. Then he said, "I owe you something." She waited. "When you came here, the thing I was most afraid of wasn't that you'd fail," he said. "It was that you'd succeed, and it would mean I'd been wrong about something for a long time." He said it the way he said most things, plainly, with no decoration. "Not just wrong about you, wrong about what I'd been using to measure people." She was quiet. "I've been in this valley 30 years, he said. "I thought I knew what things were worth by looking at them. Turns out I was only measuring what I already understood." It was the most Silas Crow had ever said at one time in her presence, and she understood that it had cost him something real to say it, and she did not make more of it than it was, or less of it than it was. "It's a hard thing to revise," she said. "The measuring." "Yes," he said. "It is." He left, and she stood in the north chamber for a moment with that conversation sitting in the air around her. She thought about what it took, the specific courage it took, for a man like Silas to say that. Not the apology from February, which had been about a specific act. This was about something larger and older and harder to admit, and he had admitted it anyway, in a cold smokehouse on a Wednesday afternoon with no audience except her. She thought about her grandmother, who had been wrong about things too, and who had said once that the measure of a person was not whether they were wrong, but what they did when they found out. She had not always believed this, in the years when she was the one being measured wrong. But she believed it now, or was beginning to, which was how belief usually worked. Not all at once, but accumulating, like entries in a ledger. She added the schedule change to the common log. By the end of the second winter, Blackstone Ranch was not the same operation it had been when she arrived. This was a fact, not a boast. The numbers said it, the contracts, the fulfillment rates, the ledger entries going back 16 months, the bank balance that Garrett showed her in March, with an expression that was still adjusting to itself, not quite believing that the number was real and his. But the numbers were not the whole of it. Numbers never were. What had also changed was harder to document. The way the ranch hands moved through the property, with a different relationship to the smokehouse, a different understanding of what it meant to the whole. Pete, who had started at 6 o'clock that January morning and had not stopped learning since, and who could now run an overnight cycle alone and had done it 4 times this winter without incident. The Hatch brothers, who had stopped being extensions of Silas's skepticism and had become simply men who did their work and occasionally asked her questions about the smoke. Dutch, who had lent her his tools in September of the first year when nobody else would, and who had never said more than 12 words at a time about it, and who she had thanked properly only once, and who had accepted the thanks with a nod that meant more than most speeches. Tomas, who was 19 and knew things that most people twice his age didn't know, and who would run this place well when the time came. And the time would come, because that was the nature of time, and she had stopped pretending otherwise. And Garrett, who had written a letter in August that was 2 paragraphs long and entirely without charm, and who had stood frozen in a smokehouse doorway while 40 pounds of brine soaked into the dirt, and who had stood beside her at the fire chamber at 5 in the morning in a blizzard and done exactly what she told him, and who had argued with her about the 3rd chamber with genuine heat, and then come to a compromise and not held the argument against her or against himself, who had offered 50% and accepted 40 and not made her explain why. She thought about what it meant, all of it, the accumulated weight of it, on a morning in late March, when the thaw had moved beyond suggestion into something real, and the mud was back, and the property smelled like spring, which in Montana smelled like cold water and old snow, and something underneath both of those that was just the earth itself coming back. She was standing outside the smokehouse with a cup of coffee, which was where she had been standing with a cup of coffee for 16 months, and she was thinking about her grandmother, who had not been a small woman and had not apologized for the space she occupied, and had taught Marlowe that the best answer to being underestimated was not to argue about it, but to do the work and let the work be its own argument. Marlowe had done the work. The work had made its argument. What she understood now, standing in the mud of a Montana spring with the smoke rising from 2 chambers behind her, was something she had not fully understood when she arrived, or even at the end of the first winter, or during the contracts and the agreements and the arguments and the slow accumulated evidence of 16 months. What she understood now was that being seen, genuinely, accurately seen, was not something that happened to you. It was something you built toward. You built it through work, yes, but not only through work. You built it by refusing to make yourself smaller for the convenience of people who preferred you that way. You built it by standing in a smokehouse with brine soaking into your boots and deciding that the next batch was more important than the satisfaction of responding to the person who had poured it out. You built it by writing down everything you knew so that it would outlast you, by teaching what you knew so that it would live in other hands, by making arguments in the form of records rather than in the form of complaints. You built it, imperfectly and over time, the same way you built everything worth having. She finished the coffee. She went inside. The fire needed checking, and the morning cycle was due, and there was an entry to make in the 3rd ledger, which she had started in January, and which was filling the same way the others had, one careful observation at a time, one day at a time, accumulating into something that would still be true when she was no longer there to say it. She picked up the pen. She wrote the date. She began.